Today's episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn Street. Dunn Street partners with businesses, organisations and unions and social democratic parties across Australia and the globe to train leaders, develop engagement strategies and empower people to organise for change. Dunn Street will continue to work with folks that want to make a difference, inspire, give hope, because we need a bit of that right now, and enable leadership to achieve their shared purpose. To find out how you can partner with Dunn Street, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Hello, everyone. My name, as you know, is Stephen Donnelly, and welcome to another episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left political and cultural podcast that dives into the progressive issues of the day and the people leading them from both home and abroad. And we are at home this week. We're talking to a guy by the name of Andrew Weir, who in his day job is a public servant. In his night job, he wrote a book, so therefore he's now become what you would call an author. And the book is called Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems, and We Can Too. And in his book, he has looked overseas for how countries around the world are solving some of the policy problems when it comes to health, education, employment, the economy, jobs, inequality, you name it. Andy solved it. So if you want to find out how to solve all those problems, there are two things you can do. You can listen to this podcast and then you can buy his book. And I've got links to how you can get his book, which is called Solved. His follow-up book, once he's solved all the problems, will be called Huzzah. But you can buy this first book online. Look at the link in the bio of today's episode and that will be able to go follow that and go buy the book and help Andy feed his children. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, or your favourite podcast app. And if you're using Apple Podcasts, don't forget to leave us a review and a rating, a positive one, hopefully. And for the updates, follow our Dunn Street socials on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And this episode was once again produced by Pamela Kirikides. Let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Friday morning in downtown Melbourne. 2 podcasts in the 1 week. Look at that, just crushing out these episodes this week. Joining you on the line from downtown Melbourne as well is the policy expert, author and public servant, and author of a new book called Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems, and We Can Too. Very positive title. I like that. Andrew Weir, welcome to Socially Democratic.
G'day, Stephen. Thanks for having me. Yeah.
I don't think I've spoken to you since the 1998 NUS National Conference.
It's quite a while ago now, Stephen. A different life practically, but it has been a while.
Long time between drinks.
I
remember it. It's quite funny that we've come back and actually now are talking again, because I am not a policy expert by any stretch of the imagination, and I'm going to ask you some really stupid questions on this episode. And I apologise to you, your intellect, and the intellect of our audience as well. And you clearly are a policy expert, so much so you've written a goddamn book on it. Go back 20 odd years or however long it's been since we last spoke. The Stephen Donnelly at that conference also was not a policy expert by any stretch of imagination and would never, ever get up in front of the microphone of students and tell them about some sort of policy position. However, you did a lot and you were quite impressive at that. So, we've continued on we've been nothing but short of consistent over our careers.
Yeah. Policy is something that I've been interested in. And look, in the end, government's all about achieving outcomes for the people of the country and people of the world. And I think, whether it be through politics or whether it be through policy work, I think the actual impact that we'll have through our engagement, is the greater good is what it's all about and what I've always been focused on. So drawn to.
The only thing I'll note before we move into the more substantive conversation today is from that conference, I had the current president of the National Union of Students on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and apart from talking about all the issues that are confronting tertiary students these days, at the end I had to delve into a bit of nostalgia and ask her a whole bunch of questions about NUS conferences today, and are some of these traditions that we experienced in the 90s, are they still around? The T-shirts that the factions wear is still very much a thing. and there's a big debate about what's going to be on the T-shirts before conference, which is quite and I'm glad that's still the case. But I actually have to note that I think it was the 98 conference in which a T-shirt was unveiled on the floor, which was very, very controversial, which had the Highlander photo, and underneath it said, "There can only be one." Do you? And it was in a reference.
I don't recall that. I think I've blacked out much of that.
Right. Okay. Stephen, I thought it was a swipe at another subgroup within a group, and I just thought, I remember, if you're going to do your top 5 NUS Factions T-shirts of all time, that is definitely in my top 5. It was very, very smart, and also a great tribute to a great film.
That was another era, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was indeed. Okay,
now we're all grown up.
We are, yeah. Well, we'll see. I don't know if I've achieved that just yet. Okay, let's talk about the book. Solved: How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems, and We Can Too. First of all, what was the genesis of pulling this book together? Where did this inspiration come from?
Look, Stephen, I've been working in public policy for 20 odd years, and frankly, there's lots and lots of stuff in every bookshop, in the media, full of analysis of problems that the world faces. There's no shortage of pundits talking about problems. There's no shortage of experts talking about problems, but there aren't that many that talk about solutions. There are, and it's frankly a bit depressing, very easy to switch off and disengage. And yet, from my knowledge and my work and research that I've been doing, I knew that there'd been a number of countries all around the world that really achieving some great results, knocking off and really getting some great inroads into some of the biggest challenges that we face as a globe. And I thought, well, let's tell some of those stories. Let's engage. Let's give people some sense of what might be possible, give people a sense of hope and optimism about our capacity as humans to solve some of these big problems. And so that was the genesis. So really it's about collecting examples from around the world of those places and those jurisdictions that have really managed to crack some of those big challenges, whether it be climate change or inequality or demise of manufacturing, gender inequality, what you name it. There is a country doing great stuff in dealing with each one of those.
I'm assuming a bit of travel was involved in the research for this book. How did you first work out who's doing the best work, and then making connections with people to go out there and find out more about it?
Do you know, most of it, there's almost no travel involved. Most of it was done virtually. It was pre-COVID when I did the work, but it was
you're a pioneer.
But it was a pioneer, exactly. So look, a couple of things. I mean, there's big data sets that are available through groups like World Bank and OECD and others, and it's very easy to create and to look through that data and see which countries are achieving the best outcomes, and that might be outcomes at a point in time, or it might be most improved. And so It's very easy to look at the top of that list and say, hey, this country's getting the best outcomes. What is it about them that they're doing? And so through a search of some of the literature, but then really the genesis of the book really was cold calling a whole bunch of people all around the world, approaches out of the blue via email, and setting up a whole bunch of Skype calls with experts, with academics, with policymakers, with everyday people in a lot of those countries, to really get their perspective on from their point of view what made those countries successful. And then that pointed me into some further data analysis and academic literature. But it was really the essence of the backbone of the book is the stories that come from the people involved in the exercises through the book. And that's bloody good fun, actually, having a whole range of conversations with really interesting people from around the world. So it was a real pleasure to do.
Who, without you trying to categorize the most important to least important, or most interesting to least interesting, who were some of the people that jumped out at you, some of the stories that you sort of grabbed your imagination and attention?
Yeah, one of my favourites was in the UK, actually. There's this guy, Jonathan Shepherd, who is an oral and maxillofacial surgeon, right? So basically he works in accident and emergency wards, putting people back together after they've been punched in the face, And it was a fascinating guy. And what he discovered, like 20, 30 years ago when he was doing his work, was that firstly he discovered that during the miners' strikes of the 80s, that's more than 20, 30 years ago, during the miners' strikes of the 80s, the amount of violence that was presenting in the hospitals went up. And then what he discovered was that a lot of that violence was coming from just a handful of pubs. So it was just there's a handful of geographic locations. He also discovered that the police were unaware of about 75% of all violence that was actually taking place in that city. The police just had no idea because people weren't reporting it to the police. They weren't confident. They didn't have, they didn't see the benefit of reporting it. So the insight there really was that that if you want to get good data about violence, getting it from a hospital emergency ward is actually probably the best location to get data. And so he then stuck that he formed when he moved to Cardiff, he formed a little group called the Cardiff model, and then they basically got together the hospital people with the police, with the liquor licensing people, local council, and then they used this really amazing data analysis to look about where crime was happening, right down to individual premises, and then we're able to develop really bespoke strategies, which was really fascinating. And then he built on that, which was he discovered, for example, that people were getting glassed in the face by pint glasses. They were, it was a huge number, like 40,000 across the UK were getting glassed in the face by broken pint glasses. And he through a bit of further investigation discovered that there was one particular type of pint glass, the nonic, which has got a little bulge at the top. And that was one causing almost all the damage. And so he worked with a handful of pubs and persuaded them in a randomized control trial to introduce tempered glass pint glasses. And it found that it made a huge difference in reducing the amount of glassings. Then he persuaded the whole pub industry all through the UK to move to tempered glass and reduce the number of glassings in the UK by tens of thousands. And so this one bloke just had this massive, outside of his policy domain. His domain is, surgery, and he's just absolutely had a massive impact on violence in across the country. And you find stories like that are quite incredible, I think.
That is incredible. You're also giving me PTSD from the 80s as well. Not that I was of drinking age in the 1980s, but certainly as a young man going back to Scotland and hearing tales of my uncle's stories in pubs in Glasgow. It was a different time. Let's some of the topics that where do you start when you want to start to delve into policy frameworks by topic? Like, you have to put a cap on it because the book could be endless. So where did you sort of focus your energy and attention?
Yeah, look, I sort of asked myself, what are the big problems facing the world, and try to get a bit of a representative sample across the social, the economic, the environmental, and ensure that in 10 chapters I've got a good cross section of big problems that we're tackling, and they range from carbon abatement to and learning from Denmark through to gender inequality in Iceland, through to primary school and high school education in Singapore, and health outcomes in South Korea. There's a huge range of outcomes that were really interesting to study. But I did chapter by chapter, and I found the best examples. But then there's a whole bunch of themes that I found after the fact that ran through all of them, and it really led me. There's a couple of concluding chapters in the book that really led me to some really big conclusions about what the role of government and what we should be learning from that, and what was really interesting in all of that was that across the board, the countries that are doing well, the Nordic and Northern European countries, so that's the Scandinavians plus Germany and Austria and a few other, and Belgium and Netherlands, they are getting in almost every area outcomes that far exceed the Anglo countries of UK and the US, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. In every policy domain, and that's not just the social domains, in the economic domain, and they're getting better economic growth, they're getting higher living standards, higher incomes, at the same time as achieving lower inequality and getting better environmental outcomes. There, and when you look across the board, it's countries that have got a higher tax take, that are redistributing, that are taking a bit more tax, redistributing it. They're actually supporting vocational and other training. They're focused on public health. All of those things are actually complementary and mutually reinforcing in terms of yielding better outcomes. When you invest in the education of people, it leads to higher productivity. When you have an economy that focuses on participation in the workforce and supporting everyone, regardless of whether they've got a disability or they're a recent migrant or whatever, if they're all participating, that leads to better economic outcomes. So there's some and really big themes. Trust is the other big one that runs through. And it's quite relevant for all governments and all political parties to think about. Trust is such an important thing, and one of the reasons, whether it be the trust in the ability of the populace to report crime to the police and work with the police, as we've seen in the US lately, that trust matters. Whether it be bipartisan approaches to climate change, as we see in Denmark, trust matters. In almost every domain, trust plays a really big role in supporting policy outcomes. And trust is such a fragile thing. So I think, when we govern and in opposition, when we work through that, we really have to be conscious of things like that.
It's interesting you said trust then, because when you first raised that, in my mind, I was thinking about trust from the constituency to our elected officials and government. But it sounds like it's actually that trust has to go both ways.
Yeah, but it's trust in a whole range of areas. It's trust people. It's the trust of the citizenry in government. It's the trust of the citizenry in each other. It's the trust in trust in police. It's trust in institutions. It's trust that we think our politicians are going to be able to behave like grown-ups. It's all of that sort of. It's not just one type of trust. They're all related. And as a society, if we're fearful of our neighbours, where it's highly likely we're not going to be trusting our governments either. So it's trust is quite a concept that pervades everything, and really it's not always government that can actually secure that trust. It's sort of a culturally embedded phenomenon as well, but government certainly plays a leadership role.
Let's dive into some of these examples of strong policy initiatives and outcomes that you've discovered in your book. And let's not give it all away because we want people to read the damn thing as well. So just tease us. So let's start. The one I want to start with first of all, and I think we'll probably cover off climate change. Sorry, I'm sounding like Donald Trump at the moment. Climate change, gender equality, health, education. I want to start with jobs, and in particular, you mentioned manufacturing before. Victoria has had a strong manufacturing industry for a very, very long time, and that has fundamentally changed over the 80s, 90s, 2000s with tariffs and stuff. Point to examples around the world where you've discovered that manufacturing has maintained, because someone's still building stuff, right? But where are we finding countries where they're building stuff, but they're actually paying their workers decent rates of pay as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. In Australia, manufacturing, has declined, from about, it was at 13-14% of the economy in the mid 90s down to, about 6 or 7% now. And that's been the case in a whole bunch of developed countries, and whether it be the US or France or Canada or the UK, that trend across the board, and that's been, certainly the story we tell ourselves is that's been because of the rise of low-cost manufacturing in countries such as China. But in a country like Germany, for example, Germany has sustained its manufacturing share of the economy over the same period. It's got about 23% of the economy that is manufacturing amounts to, and that's been sustained right through the last 20, 30 years. And the rise of China has actually been good for Germany because Germany exports more products to China than it imports from China. Because if middle class people in China would still prefer to drive a BMW to a Chinese made car. All those factories in China, their assembly lines, are made from German componentry. They've got German robots on the assembly lines, and so that sort of thing. So those machine tools and others that are coming from Germany matter. And the focus of German manufacturing has really been on quality, developing products that are the best in the world in their particular niche. And that makes all the difference. They're not trying to outcompete China and Bangladesh on cost. They're not trying to be low cost because their workers are very well paid, and so it's about producing products that no one else in the world can produce. But I think there's a couple of things we learned from Germany. Firstly, massive investment and support for vocational training. Vocational training is highly prestigious in Germany, and you're getting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people a year coming through doing vocational training in the manufacturing space. Whereas in a country like Australia, we have apprenticeships in a small range of trades. In Germany, they do apprenticeships in a whole range of different areas where people can do an apprenticeship in manufacturing. And they go into manufacturing, come out of school, go into manufacturing and do things like, whether it be for procurement or marketing or a whole range of things associated with manufacturing, they're doing apprenticeships in, so that when, if and when their business turns down, they've actually got a qualification. They've got the ability to end up in another manufacturing role because they've got a qualification. The other thing that's really important is about I guess the industrial framework in Germany plays a really big role, and it's actually a great strength of Germany. It helps them become more competitive, would you believe, with a significant union share in the economy. You've got a corporate governance framework in Germany that basically mandates employee representation on the boards of companies. So you've got any company with more than 2,000 employees that's listed on the stock exchange has to have 50% employee representation on the board.
Wow.
That'd be like...
That would break the brains of Australian companies if they did that.
Yeah. Yeah, you imagine with BHP with 50% CFMMEU representation on it, it'd be incredible, and clearly that's a different cultural context. Germany comes from that very much a stakeholder economy rather than a shareholder sort of economy. But interestingly, that focus enables German companies to be quite competitive because in responding to challenges such as low-cost Eastern European manufacturing or the need to deal with downturns such as the global financial crisis, the unions and the employee representatives are actually part of the decision making in that company and are quite prepared to say, we're going to back off on our wage demands for a temporary period so that the firm can stay competitive, or we're going to go to 4 days a week for a period of time, because we prefer people didn't lose their jobs. And there's this great collaboration between government and the unions and the companies, so that during the global financial crisis, they had this thing called Kurzarbeit, which is short work, where the German government, a bit like JobKeeper in a lot of ways, the German government funded the wages of people who agreed to go part-time during the global financial crisis. And then the workers then used that time to go and get retrained, a couple of days a week. Came back. So after the crisis was over, they came back more highly qualified. No one had lost their job. And so that union government employer collaboration enables Germany just to really go from strength to strength. It's not as adversarial. I could go on about Germany. Yeah, it's quite an incredible story.
Maybe we just do a German podcast. I find that interesting because there is, how you could do another podcast with someone from the union movement as well on this. But the word adversarial, that's something that is definitely I've picked up in my recent years of engaging with. Not so much German actually, but more Scandinavian unions about their approach to their relationship with employers and with government, that it's collaborative, it's not adversarial. And I almost feel like in the Australian union movement, collaborative is a dirty word. You know, if you're a
Yeah.
union that's
Yeah.
collaborative with employers and government, you know, you're a scab union almost.
Yeah. Well, I think it's an interesting question. You know, the question that I would put, or a German union probably would put, which was, how can the union help the company become more competitive?
Mm.
How can the union movement help the economy become more competitive? You know, and that, you know, is at the heart of the German approach. Don't hear that so much in Australia.
No, you don't. Let's keep moving through the list. Let's go to climate change.
Sure.
And this is one that I find interesting just because, like, from an organizing standpoint, you know, climate change is constantly, as we move into an election cycle, climate change is always talked about. You know, this is going to be the climate change election, and people are going to vote with their feet when it comes to climate change. But it's something that we're not solving. Well, certainly the organizational side of this bargain, we're not solving that. And I've often wondered, is it a lack of urgency? I think it's a whole bunch of problems. But I'm really interested to hear from you the policy solution here before we can even get to the how do we communicate that policy solution to people to see the urgency and mobilize people around this to make these solutions happen, which is that's the role of organizing essentially. So who's doing great work when it comes to addressing the challenges our climate's facing?
Yeah, well, this in the book, I really delve into Denmark as a country that's getting some great results. I mean, Denmark, since the early 1990s, has halved its per capita carbon emissions. It's been quite impressive, and that's at the same time as its economy has grown at roughly the same rate as Australia's, for example. So Denmark's shown us that you can not only you can reduce energy consumption, reduce carbon emissions, and grow the economy all at the same time. You can decouple economic growth from carbon emissions. It is possible. They've shown us that. And I think what's been really interesting about the Danish approach is that in a lot of ways, it hasn't been ideological. And it's been part of the economic growth story of Denmark, whether it be a small rural farming community that I engaged with, where a conservative rural farming community decided to go to carbon neutrality and invest in wind turbines as a way of stimulating economic growth in that community and repositioning it in the face of an aging and declining population. Whether it be Copenhagen and its focus on building a sustainable, livable, highly competitive city that was built on public transport and cycling and low emissions. I mean, that's all part of the story of creating a new country, and it doesn't require people to sign up to some sort of ideological crusade to actually get on board with this agenda. It's just a modern progressive agenda about a contemporary economy. And as a result, what we've seen is bipartisan approaches to climate change in Denmark. The centre right government in Denmark, until prior to the last election, was driving quite a significant emissions agenda. I mean, we now had an agenda that said that a 2018 energy agreement, which would be transitioning to 100% renewable electricity by 2030. Denmark's already at 50% renewable electricity, and it'll be at 100% by 2030, shutting down its last coal-fired power station. And that was instituted by the centre-right government in Denmark. And what's really interesting is that every energy agreement in Denmark is not just signed by the government of the day, but it's also signed by the opposition party as well. And so that's all about securing investment certainty, so that those investors who are going to invest in the very expensive multi-billion-dollar energy infrastructure can have confidence that if there's a change of government, that the policy framework will be sustained through that change of government. And if without investment certainty, no one's going to invest. And that's one of the problems that's bedeviled Australia is we've had this great policy uncertainty about energy, about climate change, and the bipartisan sort of approach in Denmark has been right at the heart of it, I think.
It's become our third rail of policy in Australia, and unnecessarily so. And I don't know how we undo that.
Yeah, I think the path home has got to involve finding a bipartisan sort of agreement somehow, and I think that's the challenge of the policy wonks inside of government to actually work out a policy framework that's going to work for both sides of politics, that everyone can sign up to. Because it's a challenge that's not going away. It's a challenge that's only going to get harder and worse the longer it's left. It's in everyone's interest we get on top of it.
I know, and I just fear that if the Tories keep on pre-selecting absolute Neanderthals that are living in the 1930s, it's just harder to get it through their caucus. It's just particularly if they're electing them from electorates that are so reliant on old forms of energy that they're just not going to give up that real estate, that electoral real estate, which is a political. It's a political conundrum.
Yeah, but I take heart from someone like Ross Garnaut in his book recently, for example, and it talks about the opportunities of cheap renewable electricity being, and once upon a time, Australia's great strength was cheap electricity and cheap energy driving the industrial base in regional parts of Australia. With global commodities, but increasingly the large multinationals and those involved in the global supply of industrial commodities will be seeking cheap zero carbon electricity to supply their products. They'll be looking around the world to find the lowest cost zero emissions electricity, and Australia's got all the assets. It's got solar, it's got sun, it's got wind, it's got communities in regional areas with industrial heritage. Ross Garnaut argues that why couldn't the next aluminium smelter that goes in the world be in Portland? It's powered by renewable electricity. And so there is real opportunity to marry together that regional agenda with that industrial agenda with a renewable energy agenda, whereby I think everyone can get on board. I'm excited by that type of prospect. It needs a bit of leadership, I think.
I want to move away from the Scandinavians for a moment and actually turn to an area of the world in which we, as Social Democrats, possibly don't look to for best practice when it comes to policy development, and that's Singapore. You wrote extensively in your book in particular in education and the work that the Singaporean government and that have been doing with primary school students and the results that they're finding there. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this thing, there's this data set called PISA, which is an OECD data set that gives standardized tests to 15-year-olds all around the world in maths and English and reading, collaborative problem solving, a whole range of areas. And Singapore just blitzes those results, achieves the best results anywhere in the world. The average Singaporean student is like a year and a half ahead of Singaporean 15-year-old is about a year and a half ahead of the average Australian in maths, for example.
And probably 6 years ahead of me right now.
That's right, quite possibly. But the most disadvantaged Singaporean students are achieving results on par with the average Australian student, for example. And I think what's really interesting in the Singaporean experience is clearly it's got some cultural dimensions in that cultural side of things, and with the value placed on education by families in a country like Singapore, clearly. But there's also some potential transferables in there too. And I think there's a couple of things. Firstly, Singapore has a focus on government schools. 98.5% of all schools in Singapore are government schools. There's only a small number of schools that are for sort of expats that are private schools, but also Singaporean students go to government schools. Singapore demonstrates that government schools can deliver the best results in the world. The other thing I think that Singapore focuses on is teaching and the absolute centrality and importance of teaching and teachers, because it invests massively in teaching. Teachers in Singapore get 100 hours of funded learning and development every year. For example, they travel the world to learn from the best. They have multiple different pathways that enable them to go on to pursue different careers, whether it be as a curriculum expert, for example, or as what they call a master teacher, someone who mentors and coaches other teachers, or goes into leadership roles in schools. They really value and invest in their teaching. And I think some of those lessons, I think, are really powerful for a country like Australia. And whilst we have to be careful that, of course, not everything's transferable. It doesn't hurt to go and take inspiration and to expand the type of conversations we're having in Australia, and by learning from countries that are different to us.
Who knew that living under a benevolent dictatorship would produce such great results? Maybe Australia could look at that as well. But we had Kevin Rudd, and that didn't work out so well, so perhaps not. Let's turn to, because I'm conscious of the time, health. And I think we can probably stay in the same region, because I think you did some good research in terms of healthcare. And we're actually also following the migratory patterns of Tom Cargill here to Korea.
Yeah, we looked at South Korea, and I think, one of the interesting things that really is that South Korea, it's got the largest increase in life expectancy of any country in the world. From the 1950s through the Korean War, when its life expectancy in South Korea was in the 50s, it's now well on the way. It's now got life expectancy at approximately 84. South Korean women will be very, very soon have life expectancy of approximately 90, and the highest life expectancy in the world. And it's quite incredible when you compare and contrast that with the United States, for example, where life expectancy is going backwards, and that the life expectancy of a country like that is being outdone by Puerto Rico and Cuba, and in the United States is really demonstrating what not to do in terms of health outcomes. But a country like South Korea isn't spending a truckload on health, but what it does do is it's got an efficient universal healthcare system. It has some absolutely brilliant hospitals and healthcare. It's using technology at the heart of it. But I think the really thing that comes through for South Korea is that on the one hand, you've got this absolutely top-notch first world sort of healthcare system, coupled with a traditional diet. And I think that's the insight here, because the biggest threats to the health of people in a country like Australia or the United States or the UK is actually they're not infectious diseases, they're lifestyle diseases. Essentially, it's obesity, it's diabetes, it's heart disease, it's stroke. They're the biggest killers now, and they're the self-inflicted diseases that come from poor diet, poor exercise, and alcohol abuse and smoking. And it's those preventable diseases, I think, that South Korea has actually managed to largely avoid through holding on to largely a healthy diet. And the government, for example, supports funded school lunches every day for students involving a traditional Korean diet, which is high in vegetables and fiber and that sort of thing. And
great chicken.
It's doing it. Yeah, it's doing everything it can to to try and avoid that. And I wouldn't mind Korean lunch every day.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, I'm getting hungry right now. And I was in Seoul last year. This year's been such a blur that I can't remember what year. Yeah, it was last year. And you still saw a lot of the American fast food chain restaurants, in all the shopping centres and complexes like McDonald's and the KFC and that. So is it is it the government intervention in programs like school lunches that have been the difference? Is it that culturally Korean food has had such a stronger impact in the food that they just consume all the time? Like Australia, like Korea's been around a lot longer than Australia, and our food base is largely influenced by external factors, really. I mean, we all make the joke about if it wasn't for the Italians and the Greeks and the migration of the 1950s, we'd all still be eating, meat and two veg, right? So we're heavily influenced by the people that have come to this country and brought their wonderful foods and customs with them. But with that, we've also brought in McDonald's and KFC and Burger King and all that kind of stuff as well. Why has Korea being able to manage to navigate that sort of the globalization of food and maintain that people are still eating healthy diets?
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure that it's all government either. To be fair, I think there's an identity question that I think that runs through that. Certainly, that's the biggest fear within the Korea is that everyone will revert to a diet more akin to an American diet, and that will lead to great obesity and lifestyle disease, and which is why you see those government programs intervening in schools, etc. But I'm not sure there's an easy government solution to that question of diet. But look, frankly, we've seen some really good public health interventions in Australia too, and that points to what's possible. You look at what the great success of Vic Health over the years, for example, in Victoria, through changes to road. I mean, we've got great public health outcomes, whether it be road safety, whether it be reductions in smoking. We're actually quite good at public health in terms of changing behaviour and influencing behaviour so that people take decisions that are actually going to prolong their own lives. I'm optimistic, and Australia's not doing too badly on that front, I think.
Last question before we go, because I know you've got to run. This is actually a terrible way to end the podcast because you've tried to end it on a positive one. I was about to say, where is the area where Australia most drastically needs to address a policy challenge from the stuff that you have researched in your book?
Climate change, clearly. Yeah. Australia is in 30 years, we've seen essentially no improvement in our per capita carbon emissions. That's clearly an area where we've done a dismal job, but we've talked about that. The other area is probably inequality. Australia doesn't do particularly well when it comes to inequality. We're probably not as bad as some countries, Chile or Mexico or the US, but we're certainly somewhere down the bottom of the OECD league tables in terms of inequality, whether that be income inequality, gender inequality, and I think one of the reflections, just to leave you with this, when I like you, I grew up through the 80s and the 90s, and there was always this big debate about growing the pie versus carving up the pie equally, and you had to choose one or the other. On the one hand, the sort of neoliberal agenda was you had to focus on growing the pie, and if you're going to grow the pie, you had to allow inequality, and on the other hand, it was going to carve it up equally. What actually all the evidence says now, all the data and all the examples and all frankly the OECD and the World Bank and the IMF all now agree, is that by carving the pie up more equally, by reducing inequality, that actually leads to greater economic growth. So you can actually have your cake and eat it too in a lot of ways. And actually, if you allow too much inequality, you're actually constraining your economic growth. We need to be investing in the education of the most disadvantaged people so that they can go on and live productive and engaged lives in society. That makes a difference, that stuff. But the policies on the side of reducing inequality and securing economic growth at the same time. We can have both.
Which is it's the cornerstone of social democratic parties as well. So that's good to hear. Because I know sometimes over these journeys when we lose elections, we sort of go through these sort of spirals of depression and self-doubt about, are we actually, do we have the answers that are going to solve the problems for our nation and our globe? And it's very positive to think about that, we are on the right track, but we just need to persevere.
Well, the countries around the world that have the highest living standards, the you have the greatest living standards, the greatest GDP per capita, that are actually on all those traditional economic metrics. They're actually mostly the Scandinavian countries, the Northern European countries, and they're the countries that also have relatively low inequality. So there's actually an evidence base when it comes to cross-country comparisons showing that you can, that low inequality and economic strength actually go hand in hand. I find that really quite powerful and quite exciting. And as a country like Australia, I don't think we should be aiming for anything less than both.
Andy, we thank you very much for taking the time to come out on the show today. I don't want to sound like I'm on the Home Shopping Network, but how do you buy your book?
Yeah, so Solved, How Other Countries Have Cracked the World's Biggest Problems and We Can Too. Available now in all good bookstores.
Excellent. And can you get it online?
And online. You might want to go to the Black Ink website. That's the publisher, or any of the good online bookstores as well. There's a Kindle version or a hard copy version as well.
Excellent. Is there an audio book? People like audio books, I'm hearing these days.
No audio book yet.
You haven't done the deal with Morgan Freeman to get him to read the book?
It would be good, but maybe in future, if enough people read it.
Very good. Mate, thanks for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. I hope the book goes super well. It's a great book. I encourage everyone to go out there and read it, particularly all the policy wonks. And in fact, idiots like me, we should be reading it too, because it's actually going to help us. We're going to learn from this. So I really appreciate the work you put into this. Great.
It's an easy read, Stephen. You can do it.
Thank you. You believe in me. I appreciate that. So yeah, go out there and get yourself a copy. Andy, thanks for coming on the show today.
Real pleasure, Stephen. Thanks for having me.